Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me. The purpose of today's tutorial is to walk through how to configure Variphy single sign-on as it relates to SAML authentication with Google. Nice thing about it is Google has made it extremely simple to go ahead and set this up, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. First thing we're going to do is open up our web browser, and we're going to navigate over to the Variphy web interface. It is very important to navigate to the interface via HTTPS in this case, using :8443 as your security port. The reason that we want to make sure that we're coming into the website to set up SSO as our secure, fully qualified domain name is that as we create the single sign-on connection, it's actually going to pass the URL that we're currently logged in with as part of our credentials. So it is very important to make sure that we are coming in here using the HTTPS interface. So now that I'm over there, I'm going to log in with my admin login. And then we're going to navigate over to the system configuration options and over to the single sign-on configurations. So for this, I'm going to pop over to the gear on the right-hand side, go to the system column, scroll down to single sign-on. All right. First thing we're going to do is click Add and SAML. So it's going to ask us for a configuration name. We can pop anything in here. This is just a placeholder, a standard configuration name. This is not going to be bypassed or passed over to your IDP. Next thing we're going to do is pop over to the service provider settings. At this point, we're not going to configure any of the identity provider settings because we don't have them. We will not get these until we've provided the entity ID of the service provider being Variphy. So, entity ID. This is a free-form field. It could be anything that you want it to be. It does need to match what gets put into the identity provider, or in other words, Google. So whatever we add into this field needs to go over to Google or the identity provider settings, so that way it is able to authenticate and say, hey, this entity ID right here is valid to talk to us and log in. So it's very important that we configure this and have that same information input into Google. So now that I've got the identity ID, for the most part, the Variphy side is done. There's not too much more we need to do to input additional information from Variphy into Google. But we do need to make sure that this Variphy SSO or this entity ID is input into Google. And what that's going to do is allow you to create a XML file or metadata. That metadata that we're going to get from the Google identity provider is what we're going to plug into the rest of the configuration, and that's going to allow Variphy to talk over to Google and use the same certificates to pass proper information and authenticate. So provide this guy right over to whoever's configuring your IDP and come back with the metadata. They may come back with a couple different types of information. They are going to come back with a certificate, and that's going to look a couple different ways. One, they could come back with a certificate that's going to look something like this. Begin certificate. It's going to have the certificate information, and then it's going to have end certificate. This is perfect. If they sent you this, this is great. This is all we need. Well, not all we need, but it's mainly what we need. And we're going to take that guy, and we're going to pop it right into this X509 certificate. All right, now the certificate information is input. If they provided you that certificate, that's great. They're also going to need to provide you the IDP or the identity provider entity ID, as well as the single sign-on service URL. This is something they may just send you, or it's something that you can request specifically, and they'll go ahead and send you that information over. Now, not everybody just receives the certificate, but if you do, great. But most of the time what you're going to receive is a metadata XML file. And that is going to be this guy right here. The name could vary, but the content will be the same. So essentially what this has is everything that Variphy needs to be able to talk over to Google and say, hey, Variphy is okay to communicate with you and validate logins. So nice thing about this file is it does contain everything from our entity ID, our single sign-on URL, as well as our 509 certificate. The one problem with the 509 certificate is it matches what may be in a certificate file, but it does not have the begin certificate and end certificate, and that is a problem because that information does need to get passed. So we're going to go ahead and add that. just in case you didn't receive this nice, pretty certificate file here, we're just going to add it manually. So let's take a look back at the Variphy interface. And right here, the first thing it's asking for from your IDP is the entity ID. So we're going to navigate over to our XML file and pull out the entity ID. So if I blow this guy up and I take a look through the XML here, I'm going to see entity ID. Take everything within the quotes and paste that into Variphy. Done. On to step 2. Next thing it's asking for is the single sign-on URL. So if I go ahead and go back to my metadata XML file, and I take a look through here, I'm going to see something called single sign-on service bindings. This is going to go ahead and give us the URL that we need to authenticate over to your IDP, or to Google in this case. So you'll notice it's got 2 of these. It's got a redirect and it's got a post. In my experience, these have always been the same. They could be different. We're going to go ahead and use the redirect URL. And we're just going to copy what's in between the quotes and pop that into Variphy. There we go. So the next thing it's asking for is that X509 certificate. Also in our metadata file, but you'll notice again it does not have the begin certificate and end certificate, and it is important to be able to get that information in there. So if we don't have that, what we're going to do is we're going to copy the certificate information. That's going to be everything after the X509 certificate and between the brackets, and we're just going to copy all of that information out and paste that right into the IDP X509 certificate. From here, we're going to scroll to the top, and we're going to manually add the begin certificate and end certificate. This is easy to do. It's not extremely hard. It's just basically a series of 5 dashes, capital begin certificate, 5 dashes, no spaces afterwards, and then 5 dashes end certificate, 5 dashes, no spaces afterwards. So we're just going to go ahead and add that manually if we're working off the metadata XML file. So I'm going to pop up to the top of my document. It is important that we have the right amount of spaces or no spaces at all, because those spaces do get translated, and if there is a space in there, it is not going to match the authentication for Google. So for this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hyphens, begin certificate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're going to go down to the bottom and do the same exact thing. Again, I'm going to come to the very end of the file and just hit enter to go down. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. End certificate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I've just basically added the beginning and the end of the certificate. This is going to allow us to properly translate just the content of the certificate over to Google. So now that we've got our entity ID, we've got our single sign-on URL, we've got our certificate in there. The next thing we're going to take a look at here is the attribute name for username. So what this is the field that Variphy is going to look for the user ID in. So let's say, for example, I have my Google ID and I have it in Variphy and it's victor@variphy.com. So where should Variphy look within the Google infrastructure to see victor@variphy.com is a valid user? So essentially what Google does is it allows you to map what field the username is going to be found in. So that's a Google configuration. It's just a general mapping configuration, and you're going to go ahead and map it to whatever you want. I could come in here and call it Steve if I wanted to, but whatever you put into the Google system for mapping is what you want to be able to mimic here. In my case, we have AD SAM account name input into Google for mapping, so I'm going to make sure that this also reads AD SAM account name. And for the most part, we're done. We're going to scroll down to the bottom over here, click Create. That's going to go ahead and pop us back over to our SSO configuration screen where we can see we've got SAML Google config, and we're going to go ahead and click Activate. All right, so from here, that's it. We're pretty much up and running. A couple things I'm going to show you real fast is if I edit this configuration after I've activated, one of the things you're going to notice here is our metadata URL. So this is why I said it is very important to go ahead and use that HTTPS fully qualified domain name :8443, because Variphy automatically recognizes it based off the URL that we're in, and this is the metadata URL that Variphy is going to be using. Again, that's the importance of having that information in there. Now, your IDP or Google may come back and they say, hey, we now need your metadata. So now that they've given you theirs, or you have the Google metadata input that you pulled through here, they may say, hey, we want to see your metadata now just to make sure everything's matching. Or let's say you've gotten this far and things aren't quite working. Well, you may need to validate that the metadata that you're sending from the service provider is accurate. So to be able to pull the Variphy metadata URL, all you're going to do is after you've activated the single sign-on configuration, once you edit it, you can copy this guy right out of here, punch him into a browser, and what he's going to do is actually export his own meta file. And you'll notice right here, metadata, in my case it's metadata3.xml, and this is something you can go ahead and provide over to your IDP or Google so that they can validate that they've got the proper information as far as entity ID. Again, Google does make it very simple to go ahead and set this up, so this is most likely something you're not going to need to do, but if you are trying to do some troubleshooting, you can absolutely pull the Variphy metadata information and send that over to the IDP or to whoever's managing your Google platform. All right, so now that we've got that, we're good, we're all set up. Let's go ahead and set up a user. So I'm just going to cancel out of here. This is active. So the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is we need to create a user that's going to be allowed to talk to Variphy as well as Google. So I'm going to pop over to my gear on the right-hand side, go to my user accounts and groups, and I'm going to click add. So you'll notice that we are now using single sign-on. If I try to go to a password field, it's going to say, no, 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 you cannot do that because you are using single sign-on. The only way you're going to be able to put a password in is if you bypass single sign-on, which we're not going to go ahead and do. So I'm going to enter my Google account in here, and I'm just going to scroll down and make myself an administrator and save. So now let's go ahead and take a quick peek at what we've created here. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and open up another browser window here because I imagine my admin login is probably cached in here. So I'm going to open up an incognito browser. I'm going to go to my HTTPS, and there I have my Variphy Testing 01 and the domain name. So I'm going to hit enter to go ahead and bring that in. Now, I am using an incognito browser, so it is not going to let me right in because it doesn't have a username. So it's asking me what my Google login is. And in this case, I'll punch in my Google login here, click next. All right. And it's going to go ahead and ask me my password. So after I put my password in, you may hear a chime. What that's doing is we're using two-factor authentication, and so should you be. But you're going to go ahead and chime, and it's going to actually chime my phone to make sure that this is me logging in. And let's go ahead and see if we can hear that. There we go. And that's my phone asking me if I am okay to authenticate. I'm going to click yes. And now it's going to go ahead and two-factor authenticate right over to Variphy, right over to Google. It's going to make sure Victor at Variphy is a legitimate user, and he is, and allow me right into Variphy. So, hey, thanks for hanging out with me during this tutorial. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out, support@variphy.com, or hit us up on chat and join any of our webinars. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time, guys.